Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you can take your seats. Thanks. Welcome. My name is Ian Whitaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm very pleased to welcome Jeffrey Gettleman to the Council this evening. Copies of his new book, Love Africa, a memoir of romance, war and survival, will be available for sale and signing after the program from our partners at the bookseller, just over there. We are on the record this evening. We're live streaming. We welcome social media as always, but please silence your phones before we begin. The Council is a membership organisation. If you are a member, thank you for your support. It helps us to continue to produce affordable, accessible and independent content like this evening's event. If you're not a member, I hope you'll consider joining one of our membership levels, which begin at $100. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, non-partisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active US engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We're coming to the end of our programming year at the Council, but there are still some great events in our calendar. Of note, next Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, the Council and the Financial Times will host the 3rd Annual Chicago Forum on Global Cities. Experts, practitioners, heads of state, business leaders from across the world will discuss the influence of global cities and their role in addressing global challenges. Please see our website for the full agenda. Turning back to this evening's program, after Mr. Gettleman's remarks, we'll open up to your questions, which I'll take from in the room and also from an online platform. Just type chi.cnf.io directly into your browser. You should see an address over there, and you can ask a question. You can vote on other people's questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Jeffrey Gettleman is the Nairobi-based East Africa Bureau Chief for the New York Times, a position he's held since 2006. He's reported on conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Kenya, Congo, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Yemen. He was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 2012. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Gettleman.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It's a beautiful day outside, so for locking yourself in this room for an hour or so, I really appreciate it. I wanted to start, so I've been all around the world, and this is where it all began, because I grew up in Evanston, Illinois. I know it's not Chicago, it's Evanston. And I didn't, it's kind of a miracle and a surprise even to myself that I would end up living and working in Africa because this wasn't something that was ever really in the ether when I was a kid growing up in Evanston. Our big trip abroad, those years growing up, was to Chinatown. And we really didn't, you know, I think my dad got his first passport at age 40. We didn't take family trips, you know, all around the world. It was just something that wasn't, you know, I'd never met anybody that worked in Africa. I never met any journalists growing up. I thought I would be a lawyer like my dad, and just kind of always assumed that was going to be my path, and I would stay in Chicago and have a life and career here. But during my freshman year in college, I went on a transformative trip that was like a left turn in life. It kind of came out of nowhere, and when I returned, I was a different person. And when I was a freshman at Cornell, I found out about this trip driving across East Africa from Nairobi to the border of Mozambique and Malawi. And it was a total fluke. I had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who was organizing a trip to bring medical supplies to refugees from Mozambique. This was 1990, and at the time, Mozambique was one of the worst civil wars in the world. It was a relic of the Cold War, where there was a left-leaning government that got a ton of support from the Soviet Union, and there were rebels that were committing horrible atrocities that were backed by the United States and South Africa. And there were all these proxy wars in Africa at the time, many of them connected to South Africa. The South Africans were causing chaos in a lot of the countries around South Africa to keep them from becoming bases for the ANC and for guerrillas that would try to overthrow the apartheid government. And the US, believe it or not, was on the side of South Africa. So I found out about this trip And I knew we were told the destination was Malawi, and nobody in our family knew where that was, even knew it was a country. And my mom spent the weeks leading up to that trip calling the CDC every day, checking on the latest outbreaks, and making sure I had every pill, vitamin, precaution possible. And my arms were lined with shots as I could barely lift my arms when I was getting on that plane. But I ended up, my parents are here, and there's not many times in your life you can publicly thank your parents. So I would like you guys to just stand up for a second. I'm up here, you can do it. All my friends from college, when they meet my parents, they're like, your parents are so normal. So they actually went for this trip, and I left out the fact that the leader of this expedition across 1,000 miles of rural Africa was a 19-year-old college dropout. That I didn't tell them. But it's true, he was, and we had an amazing experience. And I've gone back to try to figure out what was it that happened that summer that really made me feel like a different person and provoked this kind of crisis and this confusion of what I was going to do with my life. But a big part of it was I had grown up in Evanston, which is a sheltered, relatively privileged place, and this was my first exposure to really intense poverty. To be driving through rural Africa in 1990, people were literally wearing rags. There's a whole secondhand clothes industry now where you make your donations to Goodwill or to the Salvation Army. That stuff gets bundled, shipped to Africa. People buy it for very cheap. And you see people now on the streets in the rural areas of Africa wearing pretty decent clothes because of this huge industry, which didn't exist at the time. So we were in a truck and just driving down these rural roads south from Nairobi to Malawi. And everybody we meet in these rural areas was wearing rags. And we would stop and go into people's houses, and the only possessions many people had was a blanket bundled up on a dirt floor. And the children had no toys. They would make soccer balls out of plastic bags and just pack them together really tightly and put strings around them. And I had never seen anything like this. But at the same time, there was a sense of joy and warmth and interconnectedness between people that had nothing. And that just really blew me away, to think that people that had so little could still be so happy. And, obviously not all of poverty is great, and I'm not going to glorify that. But there was a sense of connectedness between people. And even the handshakes, I tell people today, in Kenya, in that part of the world, when you shake somebody's hand, it's like a 5-minute handshake. You go up to them and you say, hi, how are you? How's the family? And you're not pulling your hand away. You're continuing to hold hands. You see this in Kenya, 2 grown men standing on the street, holding hands for 5 minutes while they catch up with each other. And there was just this sense that people were more connected to each other. I would see kids walking to school like in a whole chain with their arms around each other, or carrying bags, one person with each strap. And so I just came back from that trip thinking, for whatever reasons, like, this is a part of the world that I want a piece of, and I want to live there. I want to work there. And it was a very inconvenient passion, because I didn't know anybody that was really doing that, and I had no models. And I went back to Cornell, and I wanted to take a junior year abroad in Africa, and there wasn't a single program, not a single one. The travel abroad office was stacked with brochures to Greece, to Europe, to China, all over the world, South America, but there wasn't a single program south of the Sahara Desert. So I took a year off. Again, the fabulous parents in the second row supported this. I had a house painting company called Da Vinci Brothers. None of us were Italian. None of us were great painters. But we raised money that way to fund travels. Actually, yeah, we painted your house, and you're here. It's amazing. It took like 5 weeks. It should have taken 1. So I was trying to just kind of wing it, obviously, to just carve out a life that meant something to me. And as I progressed, I had some choices, as people do who go to a good school and come from an affluent family. And there was a very well-beaten path to investment banking, to law school, to work for a management consultancy. And I did a graduate degree in England, and the only people coming to hire were the banks and the management consultant firms. And I had a whole bunch of friends that went down that path that had, a million footprints on it. And I wasn't sure. Like right now I'm standing here, I was introduced as a journalist for the New York Times. I have a book. It all kind of worked out. But at the time, it didn't feel like that at all. And this is something I write about in the book, in a message that I want to transmit to younger people, which is we put so much pressure on ourselves to have it all figured out. And you project this certainty and this focus. And really, you're not focused. You don't know who you are or what you want to do. And I was like that. I was doing interviews at the same time I was dreaming of going to Africa, doing interviews for Wall Street and for other jobs that had nothing to do with Africa. So finally, I settled on journalism. And it was kind of a risk because, again, I didn't know many newspaper reporters. That wasn't sort of in the mainstream of what people were doing. My friends were going off to these big city jobs in Washington and London and New York. And I sent out 200 applications for a newspaper job. I had gotten this phone book-sized Bible of the newspaper industry called Editor and Publisher. And I copied down the addresses of the city editor and Toledo Blade and, the Cincinnati Enquirer and all these papers all across the country and sent out literally like a stack of manila envelopes. Like my tongue tasted nasty from licking these things. And I got one job offer, exactly one job offer. But that's all you need, right? So I took this job in a small town in Central Florida called Brooksville, which, I hate to use the word, but I'll do it anyway, was like a little redneck town. They say in Florida, the farther north you go, the farther south you get. Because southern Florida is a very cosmopolitan place, northern Florida is the deep south. And this was like in the middle. And I had no real training. I didn't go to journalism school. I'd never taken any journalism classes. And I'd kind of talked my way into this job. And my mission was to get the job I have right now. Like I was determined to work in Africa. And I kept that to myself because everybody that I was working with, they would have thought they had no interest in that. It was all about local news. And I did any story I could get. I covered the police beat. And I covered, really small time. I mean, our bar was barely above the ground of what passed for news. DUIs, non-fatal car accidents. One of my big stories, like my first few weeks, was a woman who raked her lawn topless, got arrested. That was like big news. So I was so eager to prove myself I would take anything. And one day I came into the office, and my boss said to me, "We want you to do an interview with this suspected killer, Willie Crane." And I was like, okay, I was eager to get scoops, and that was like an opportunity for a scoop. So the facts were that this man, Willie Crane, was a crab fisherman. He was a very uneducated guy living in the kind of swamps of Tampa Bay in a rundown trailer, and his business was planting crab traps around Tampa Bay. And then, there are these steel traps that sit on the bottom of the ocean, covered in seaweed, and you pull them up and you get the crabs and you sell them. And he had met a woman shortly before I was given this assignment at a bar. She was a heroin addict. She took him home. They watched TV at her house. She had a little girl in her house. She said her back hurt, and this guy, Willie Crane, gave her 5 Valium. She took the Valium, was knocked out, and when she woke up in the morning, Willie was gone and her daughter was gone. And these missing children stories become like enormous local news. And overnight, there were pictures of the girl, have you seen me, stapled to trees. There were dive teams combing Tampa Bay because the suspicion was that this guy had done something to this girl and disappeared her or put her body in a crab trap and hid her that way. But there was no evidence whatsoever to link him to the crime. So he wasn't arrested. So he was on the loose, and everybody wanted to know, who is this guy? And this was like a big story on the police beat. And he had denied it. He had been questioned by the police, where were you? Oh, I left that woman's house. The girl was sleeping in the bed. That's all I know, and they had nothing on him. So I convinced his daughter to contact him on my behalf because he had refused a bunch of other journalists, and I showed up at his house. And I was terrified. I was 25 years old, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, untrained. Nobody had ever told me how to interview a, murder suspect. You just kind of fake it, those first jobs. That's how you got the job. And so I knocked on the door of his trailer, and he lived in this like ramshackle, double-wide trailer with tinfoil on the windows. The porch was sort of rotting into the swamps, big bushy trees all around, because that part of Florida is actually, it's almost like a jungle. It's very lush. And I knock on the door, and he opens it, and I immediately notice that he's got 2 black lines drawn on his neck, like magic marker lines, like right here. And I say, Willie, what's going on with those lines? And he said, the police want a blood sample, and if they come to my house, I'm going to give them all the blood they can get, and I'm going to slit my throat. And he takes me into the kitchen, and he sits me down at this table, and he's got this enormous knife at his elbow, and he's really agitated, and he could feel this kind of net closing in around him. So I'm like, okay, I'm on a suicide watch now. And we just start small talking. I'm just trying to kind of keep the conversation going. And I look at him. He had a plate of pork chops in front of him. I had interrupted his lunch. And he's eating these pork chops, like very ferociously, just big pieces of meat he's sticking in his mouth and chewing really loudly. And I say, Willie, looks like you're hungry. And he looks at me and he goes, damn Skippy, I'm hungry. This is the first meal I've had since that little girl died. And he slipped up because he had been denying that he knew anything about this girl. And all of a sudden, his eyes started twitching, but he didn't say anything. But I could tell he was really nervous, and I was even more nervous because I'm sitting there thinking he did it. He killed this girl, and I'm like the only one who knows that. So I spent the next few minutes like jotting down some BS notes and questions, and got out of there as fast as I could. And that story became a huge local story. And it was a stepping stone for me to the next step, which was at the LA Times. Meanwhile, Willie, the police kept searching his house, and they found a pair of underwear with a little blood stain on it. And it was the girl's blood, the missing girl. It was her DNA. And they convicted him of murder and kidnapping, first degree, and he was sentenced to death. And they've never found that girl's body. And it's a very rare case to have a murder conviction with no body, no crime scene, no real explanation of what happened, except there was no way that that blood would be on his underwear, and she would be gone unless he did something to her. So I realize this has nothing to do with Africa, but has to do with me, and you're partly here to hear this stuff. So I ended up working, continuing to climb the ranks of journalism. And then September 11th happened. And that was like a blast in all senses of the word, in that all of a sudden there were opportunities for journalists to go overseas. And I was sent to Egypt, and then to Yemen, and to Afghanistan, and to Iraq, in very short order, because there was this appetite to figure out what's going on out there. The 1990s were like a period of, it was like the country was asleep, and we thought, the Cold War was over, and there's no other big force out there we have to reckon with, and America's power is undisputed, and there's, no other sort of big geopolitical worries. And so all of a sudden that was shattered on September 11th. And I had always wanted, this all was a means to an end. I still really wanted to get this Africa job, but it was out of reach. And I was still a relatively young reporter, just trying to prove myself. And finally, in 2006, after sort of going through all this, it took 10 years, which was way longer than I thought. When I got into journalism, I was like, yeah, I'll do well, and I'll be in Nairobi 3 years later. But it didn't. I had to pay my dues, and it was like I wouldn't have it any other way. And as I write in the book, like that first job in Brooksville and having those strange experiences with that guy, Willie Crane, was like as good a training as I could ever get for handling stress and thinking on your feet and just kind of reading the landscape as best you could, and writing, and just writing lots of stories. That's the only way you're going to get better. And so in 2006, I became the bureau chief in Nairobi, and this was my dream job. And I moved there with my wife, who I had met early on when I was a student at Cornell. She was like 17, 18, I was 19. And we've been together for years. It took us a long time to get our acts together and get married, but we did it, and we moved to Nairobi together in 2006. And Kenya, have many people here been to East Africa before I make sweeping stereotypes? So Kenya's Nairobi is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's at 6,000 feet altitude, right on the equator, very green, amazing climate, 60 or 70 degrees almost every day, sunny, just a beautiful, objectively beautiful place. And it's a base for companies, for diplomats, for journalists, aid workers, because it's a very stable, pleasant place to live. And you could take a plane in 200 miles in any direction and be in a much different place, whether that's in Rwanda or Somalia or South Sudan or Congo. These all are relatively close. And they all are many of those countries are steeped in war and conflict. And Nairobi's almost like this bubble. And so since I've been in Kenya, I've seen kind of two narratives that are emerging, that suck me in one way or the other. And one is economic progress and development and rapid change. It's almost dizzying in Kenya. Where I'll leave for 3 weeks and come back home in a week, and there will be some new construction site down the street where there used to be an old house. There are malls going up, with all over town, new stores, new buildings, new bridges, new ports, new airports. After years of because I've been visiting Africa since 1990, even before I was working there. And after years of just kind of seeing more or less the same, it almost felt frozen in time. That was part of its charm, that you'd go to East Africa and it felt like everything was sort of, several decades behind the West. After years of that, it's being transformed. And there's now Burger King and Pizza Hut and Domino's, all the great American exports, right? And there's a huge middle class. Like there are millions of people that now have disposable income that used to just be able to make ends meet. And I even see it anecdotally with our guards, because crime is still a problem in Kenya. Like we live in a nice house, we live behind big walls with barbed wire on top. We have guards that sit on our porch every night. And and they're not armed, they have billy clubs and a panic button that they press if there's an intrusion. And this is just standard. This is how just about everybody lives in Kenya, because the police are pretty crappy. There's a lot of poor people, and the classes, the haves and the have-nots are rubbing up against each other, and there's a lot of crime. But when I first moved there, the guards that would sit on the porch, I'd never hear them talking on their phones. They just sit there quietly. And as the years have gone on up until today, these guys now are talking on their phones all the time. Phones are ringing because they have just that much money to be making calls. And their people back home now have enough money to be using the cell phones. And it's just a little indicator of the development. And I see this everywhere. I see this when I go to Rwanda, Kigali. You know, this was a place that was in a genocide in 1994. You know, one of the poorest countries in the world. And there's, you know, new construction everywhere, brand new roads, high-speed internet. I just was doing some book events in Silicon Valley, and I swear my internet is faster in Nairobi than it was like 2 minutes away from Facebook. Swear to God. So, because they've leapfrogged, like there's not many landlines in Kenya. People just went straight to cell phone technology. And even in Kenya right now, a big thing is mobile money. I don't know if many people have heard about this, but like many Kenyans don't even carry cash. They have money stored in their phone, and they show up at a grocery store, and they buy their things, and they just send a code to the cashier, and they pay their landlord that way. They do all their banking like right in their pocket, which is how probably most of the world is going to move, and they did it out of necessity, and they developed that in Kenya. Like that technology, that software, all was developed by Kenyans in Kenya to run their banking system. So that's one story, and it gives me hope. It's inspiring, and it's changing very fast. Like it's you know, these places feel different 5 years later. It's really remarkable. But the other story that I'll cover, and I probably cover it more, is a story about conflict. And several African countries in my patch are stuck. South Sudan, a country that just got independence in 2011, with a lot of American support. And actually, George Bush, this was one of the biggest foreign policy achievements, besides the Iraq invasion, that he accomplished, that they helped South Sudan, this country that had fought decades for independence, to rule itself. They helped that country stand up on its feet. American taxpayers paid billions of dollars to give to South Sudan to build ministries, to build roads, to build schools, to stand up a state. That happened in 2011. In 2013, one of the worst civil wars in Africa broke out. And South Sudan is now one of the most dangerous places on earth. Thousands of people have been killed. The president and vice president got into a power dispute over who was going to be the next president, and they're from different ethnic groups, and they started arguing, and then they fired the vice president, and ethnic conflict broke out across that country and just ripped through it like a fuse, and tens of thousands of people have been killed, countless women have been raped, children have been murdered, there's a famine there now. The state has collapsed, like in front of everybody, after all this intervention. And it's not, I don't think I don't think we're gonna see a solution to that conflict for decades. And I see the same thing like a Central African Republic, another country I cover. Not a country many people talk about. It's totally broken. The state has fallen apart. The country's divided. People are fighting along religious and ethnic lines. That's not going to be improved anytime soon. Somalia, DRC, a lot of these places, Libya. I see sort of a new form of international relations where some of these places will never be nation states again. We're going to almost see like the advent or the reemergence of city-states, where a country like Somalia, for instance, you're going to have some stability in the capital, Mogadishu, and you're going to see some development. And it's almost like these two African narratives are happening in the same place. You're going to have some development. You're going to have some progress. You're going to have people that get interesting jobs, and their lives are going to improve. And at the same time, right outside of that bubble, maybe 50 miles away, nobody's going to be in control. The idea of a central government with one flag and one army and a bureaucracy establishing control across that space is not going to happen in our lifetime. Libya, it's not going to happen. Yemen, it's not going to happen. Syria, it probably won't happen. And you're gonna have nodes of stability, but then large spaces that are uncontrolled. And for the first time, we're in this kind of new international relations paradigm where we had colonialism for hundreds of years, And there was a vested reason to care what happened in these places like Central African Republic or South Sudan or Yemen. The colonial powers were in charge of them. And the instant that Africa got its independence, it stepped right into the Cold War in the early 60s. And all of a sudden, there was like a new colonialism, where the Soviet Union and the United States and the West began to fight, proxy wars in these countries and had a reason to care about, Somalia and South Sudan and DRC. And so we supported the state, and often at the cost of the people. We supported this dictator in Zaire, now Congo, for 30 years, and we knew everything he was doing. We knew he was stealing, he was robbing the place blind. We knew he was persecuting his people, but he was our guy, and we kept him in there. And the instant the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, some of the worst wars in Africa broke out, one after another. Somalia, Congo, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia. All that happened in a span of, 5 to 8 years after the Cold War ended. And so now there's not that overarching reason to be invested in these places for the first time in a long time. And these states were always kind of fig leaves anyway. Like Somalia, for instance, had a central government for 30 years. Very soon, we're going to reach the 30-year mark from when that central government collapsed. And so the country is going to be without a government for longer than it ever had a government. And it's sort of reverting back to its traditional ways. And it was never tightly controlled. So I see, like people ask me what are my, causes for hope, because I don't want to, and I sometimes get criticized for generalizing about Africa, and that there are 54 countries in Africa, and each has a different story and a different history, and I appreciate that, and I don't write, I go to South Sudan and I write just about South Sudan or Somalia. But there are commonalities between these countries. If you look at, let's say, the UN Development Index that ranks countries by education, lifespan, per capita income, the bottom 20 are always in sub-Saharan Africa, except for like maybe Afghanistan. And they sort of compete for last. This year it was Burundi, and last year the bottom country was Somalia, or maybe it's going to be DRC. They just kind of rotate. And so there are shared experiences of these African countries. But there's also, there's also many surprises. And for instance, I was in Congo a few years ago, and I was on a motorcycle driving through the rainforest. And I was with my wife and some other people, and we were like right off the Congo River in the heart of the Congo, jungle, the Congo River Basin rainforest, which is one of the last, untouched areas on the planet. And we're driving on a path. There's no roads in central Congo. Like there was in one of these towns nearby, I remember seeing a dirt road and a little brick peeking up from under it from 60 to 70 years ago, when the Belgians had been there and paved the roads, and they have just been totally dilapidated and neglected since then. There was more infrastructure in these areas in the 40s and 50s than there is in 2017. You see these like rusting river barges on the sides of the Congo River, and old warehouses kind of sinking into the weeds. And we were on this thin path threading through the jungle, huge trees, giant leaves, very dark, with sort of shafts of sunlight slicing down. And all of a sudden we stopped, because we were in a line of motorcycles, and the guy in front of us came to an abrupt stop and held up his hand for all of us to stop behind him. And I immediately thought, this is it. Like, somebody's going to pop out of the jungle and attack us. And there's a lot of bad guys that live in that jungle. There are rebel groups, and sort of small local rebel groups in Congo called Mai groups. There are bigger militias backed by Rwanda or Uganda that are trying to extract minerals and have taken over spaces and are killing and raping to scare people away. There's ivory poachers. This is a big issue that I cover, where these caravans of guys from Sudan and from far away, hundreds of miles away, go into the deepest parts of the rainforest to slaughter elephants, and then they drag the tusks out for hundreds of miles, eating the meat as they emerge. And so I was panicked that, something like this was what was waiting for us down the path. So my wife and I got off our bikes and we started walking. And we're on this sort of muddy path with leaves all around us. And if you walked in the wrong direction for 5 minutes, you would be lost forever. Like, you'd never get out of that jungle. And as we're walking, all of a sudden the path sort of opens up into a clearing, and there was a log across the road that had fallen, like a tree. And there were these 4 guys, I have no idea where they came from, that were chopping this tree apart with an axe like maybe this big, taking turns. And the tree was, an enormous equatorian tree that had been standing in that jungle for hundreds of years, blocking what passes for a highway. And these guys were chopping the log. Good Samaritans, nobody was paying them to do it. They must have been from some village nearby. And the most striking thing, though, was, and I write about this in the book, there was like tens of thousands of butterflies, white butterflies, covering the men, covering the clearing, covering the trees. They started landing on us. We held out our hands, and all these butterflies landed on us. And it was like this magical moment that I will never forget. And the guys paused from their labor, picked up, they were huge, like this, totally chiseled, strong men without shirts, dripping with sweat, picked up our motorcycles, carried them over the log, because that wasn't going anytime soon. No, didn't ask for money, barely, said hello, that was it. And we drove off, seeing these guys like wearing like coats of butterflies. They didn't swat them off. They just sort of kept up with what they were doing. And it was like one of the most magical things I've ever seen, totally unexpected. And it showed a lot. It showed kind of a harmony with the environment, a sense of cooperation that when pushed, these people have nothing. And when pushed or when the opportunity presents itself, they were willing to help us without asking for anything. So with that image, because that's about as good a one as I can tell up here, I would love to hear your questions and open this up into a discussion.
All right. Thank you very much. So now we'll take your questions in the audience.
Thank you.
We have microphones out there, so just raise your hand if you have a question, and please make sure your question is a question. Also take questions online using our application. Just there in front of you, Ines. Thanks.
Hi, my question is, you stated earlier that Nairobi or Kenya was a very stable place, particularly relatively in East Africa. Do you feel there are any threats to that stability right now, given the geopolitical climate and also given the upcoming elections?
I have 2 kids living in Nairobi, so I'll answer this question with some optimism. I think Kenya's trajectory in Nairobi as the capital is pretty good. I think it kind of has a destiny. And Kenya has always been one of the countries in Africa closest to the West, one of the countries with the deepest professional class, one of the most developed countries in Africa, going way back to when the British first arrived and were so kind of blown away and charmed by the landscape, by the wildlife. That's what set Kenya down its path. It was different from Zimbabwe or South Africa that became almost industrialized colonies for agriculture or mining. Kenya was never like that. It was kind of like this playground for rich people, for aristocrats. That's how it was settled. I think Kenya's future is bright, but Kenya's biggest problem is that it's very divided ethnically. And the Kenyan leaders never took seriously this idea of building a nation. They built a state. There's a good air force. There's good infrastructure. There's decent controls on weapons. They control their space. Like, it's a state. Unlike some of these other places I go, where the state is a facade or doesn't exist at all. But there was never a sense of nation, of being Kenyan. And I can hear it when I step out my door. I hear 3 different languages spoken on my street. I might hear Kamba or Luo or Luya or Kikuyu. These are tribal languages, and that's what people feel more comfortable speaking. And we saw this in 2007, 2008, when there was a disputed election in Kenya, and it quickly became an ethnic, bloodbath. And people who had lived next to each other were turning on each other. It was like this switch had been flipped, where tribe or ethnicity didn't matter one day, and all of a sudden it was a life or death issue. So that's simmering beneath Kenya. And I think it's going to be there for a long time. And that's what fuels corruption. Kenya's like a very corrupt place. I can't tell you how many bribes I've paid. Really, you get pulled over by a police officer, it's actually kind of more pleasant because you don't have to go to court, you don't get a ticket, you just give the guy some money. But just to finish, but that's connected to ethnic politics because people in Kenya vote for their guy. I could look at an ID of a Kenyan and tell with a 90% chance of certainty by the name, I know which ethnic group, I know who they're going to vote for in a major election. Because they're not going to look at the record, they're not going to care that so-and-so candidate had been accused of corruption or beating his wife or being a jerk. They're just going to pick the guy of their ethnic group. And that connects with this lack of a sense of nation, and then it leads to corruption because these guys don't have to run on it. Their record and the services they deliver is irrelevant to their political career. We're starting to see that change a tiny bit because there's this movement to decentralize government and to set up county governments. And so these counties are becoming experiments in new forms of government. And the hope is that let's say there's a guy who's running Machakos County, which is about an hour outside of Nairobi. If he does a good job, people outside of Machakos will be like, hey, that guy, paved the roads in Machakos and brought streetlights in schools. Even if he's not from my ethnic group, maybe I should think of voting for him. But that's not going to happen for a long time. So there's about to be an election in August. There's every time they have an election, everybody kind of gets really freaked out, even if it's not that bad. Like they did one in 2013, there was some violence, but not a lot. The country shut down for a week until all the votes were counted, all the election disputes were resolved in court, and the loser said, I lost. Until he did that, nobody went to work, nobody went to school, everybody stayed in their house, and that's how it's going to be this time. So if it's a close election, then it can get really nasty fast because the systems aren't so great, and people will start saying, well, maybe a few votes were stolen here or a few votes stolen there, and those votes are based on ethnic groups. So that's how it sort of pulls the country apart.
Down here in the front, John, thanks.
Jeffrey, you brought up South Sudan, and you talk about it as we helped bring the nation to birth and where it is now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the prospects there and how that can actually go to the next phase. And you talk about ethnic rivalries and so forth, defining the post-nation. South Sudan.
I would sell South Sudan short. I'd short South Sudan. I think the prognosis is really bad because I think the current leaders have a record of bloodshed, no public interest. They had years before there was any conflict to develop that country, and they didn't. They stole all that money. There was billions of dollars. South Sudan produces about 300,000 barrels per day of oil, which is small on the world scale. I think Saudi Arabia is like, I don't know what, 5 billion, 10 billion a day or something. It's a lot. The U.S. is like 8 billion. 8 million, I'm sorry. 8 million. He's looking at me like you're crazy. South Sudan produces a little oil. They generate a couple $1 billion a year with their oil. There were several years they were producing oil. There was peace. They didn't build schools. They didn't build roads. They didn't build health clinics. They stole that money. I could see these guys driving around Nairobi, ministers, muckety mucks, in the nicest cars on the road, these $100,000 Humvees and Land Rovers with South Sudanese license plates. Those guys shouldn't have been in Nairobi. They should have been working in South Sudan. I saw it. And so when there was an ethnic conflict between the top levels of the government, you had tens of thousands of young guys who knew nothing but how to carry an AK-47, raise it up to their eyes, and shoot somebody. That's like what the mass of young men know how to do in South Sudan. Country had been steeped in war. They never demobilized the army. They never gave these guys any options. And so that's what you're looking at in South Sudan now. You're looking at a disinterested, corrupt government with no new leaders on the horizon, and masses of young men who are angry and bitter and armed and divided. And it's like the Starbelly Sneetches in South Sudan. Every ethnic group has markings. This is like part of their tradition, where the Nuer have like lines across their head, and the Dinka have like a V carved into their head, carved into their skin. They've found, like anthropologists have found skulls going back a long time, where those lines were carved so deep into the flesh that there were scratches on the skull, like the knife is scraping the bone. And so everybody knows who's who. And they're just slaughtering each other. So I think the future is, I know it sounds bad, and I don't mean to like just condemn a whole place, and the people who are suffering are not the ones to blame. I think what we're going to see is maybe Juba will stay a functioning place, maybe, that's the capital, and the government will not control much territory outside of Juba. It will be basically a Dinka, with this current government, that's the tribe of the president. It will be all Dinka soldiers in Juba, and they will be holding off everybody else. The oil will not be pumped because there's fighting along that axis where the oil lines are. So the country, they have no money. They can't pay their own soldiers. That's another problem, is that some of these guys who are loyal to the president ethnically are hungry and frustrated. So they may turn, and if those guys turn on the president, his own ethnic group is going to be like Somalia. You're just going to rip the place apart. Nobody's going to be in control. It's going to break down into little pieces where this commander controls this space and this commander controls that space. And it's just going to be kind of a no man's land. And the only hope, somebody I'm sorry to go on about this, but the only hope was somebody had suggested the UN taking over South Sudan for 5 to 10 years. But that's like a very offensive idea in Africa, to recolonize a place. They probably should have done that when it got independence. They probably should have had a gap between being part of Sudan and had a gap where it was kind of, it was helped by outsiders, and then it was given full independence. But they didn't. So it's going to be very hard to go back to that. So I think South Sudan is going to be very dangerous and violent for years to come.
Let's take the third row here. The guy had his hand up for a while. Thanks.
About 6 decades ago, I was a volunteer in Ethiopia while the emperor was still alive. Many changes have happened through that process. Have you spent time in the Horn of Africa? Ethiopia is, I think, the second largest country in Africa. What is your outlook for that in the follow-up of the process that it's gone through these decades? Thank you.
I spent a week in an Ethiopian prison. That was my last time in Ethiopia. Seriously. I did a big story several years ago about human rights abuse in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the few parts of Africa that was never colonized. Ethiopia was a state. There's very few parts of Africa that had a state before colonialism. Ethiopia's history goes back hundreds of years. The emperors think they are connected by blood to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Falasha Jews trace their ancestry to the lost tribe of Israel. So Ethiopia is a very interesting place, but it's very repressive. It's always been repressive. Haile Selassie was a bastard to his people. That's why he got overthrown. He was starving them in the early 70s, and that precipitated the coup. I got in trouble because I was trying to do I did a piece on a region of Ethiopia that's ethnic Somali. Ethiopia, like all these African countries, is very multi-ethnic, but it's strongly controlled from the center. And these Somalis in the eastern part of Ethiopia who speak Somali, they're Muslims, very different from the Christian highlanders who run the country, were trying to get more autonomy, and the government was just crushing the people and burning down villages and raping women and killing civilians. And I went in there with a rebel group, and that was the only way to get in, and marched through the desert with my wife, who was shooting video at the time, It's amazing we're still married. And we spent, almost 2 weeks like walking in one of the hottest places on earth through this dusty, powdery environment, almost no water, very little food, collecting stories about atrocities committed by the military. And the instant we left these rebels, and these rebels were Muslim, Somali, and I had been worried about the rebels. I thought, is this safe? And I had good contacts that introduced me to them, and I had done all my research, but I was still concerned about that aspect of it. I never thought the government would give us problems, because the Ethiopian government is a close American ally. I was an accredited journalist. The instant I got out from the rebels and came into a town that was controlled by the government, I was arrested, thrown in prison, interrogated at gunpoint, and kept in prison for about a week without the Ethiopians telling the U.S. Embassy, telling anybody. We just disappeared in the desert. So after that experience, I've not had the pleasure of being back in Ethiopia. But to be fair, Ethiopia is an interesting place because it is doing some positive work with development. For instance, it's the only country in sub-Saharan Africa that put in a train system. So anybody in this room who's been around Africa, sub-Saharan Africa recently, knows that the traffic sucks. There's no planning. And every day, some happy Kenyan is jumping behind the wheel of his $5,000 Toyota Corolla for the first time, entering traffic with 100 other guys psyched to be driving and with their cars right behind him. And you do that over and over and over and over again, and without a lot of infrastructure development. There's been some, but not enough. And it's getting almost unlivable in Nairobi. Lagos, Nigeria is like that already. There's no planning, there's no vision. Ethiopia had a vision. And the World Bank would be happy to build a metro line in Kenya to help with the environment and to save the productivity that's lost with people sitting. Literally, it can take me 4 hours to get to the airport when it used to take 45 minutes. No joke. The Ethiopians put in a train line. That centrally controlled government can do some things that these kind of messy, democratic governments can't. It's like the China model. That's who they see as their model. They say, China doesn't have free expression. China doesn't respect human rights. China's very, centrally controlled, but they are successful at development. Rwanda's the same way. Very tightly controlled, very repressive, pretty good at poverty eradication.
White shirt there. Thanks, John. Thanks.
Yeah, two questions. One, can you comment on Chinese investment in Africa? And two, can you comment on Nigeria and South Africa?
How much time do you have? China, I get the China question a lot. I should work that into my spiel in the beginning. China is interesting because China doesn't have a 2-year, 4-year election cycle. So they don't have to deliver anything, for 10 or 20 years. They have a totally different way of governance. So they can make investments and make plans that pay off way in the future, where no American leader can do that. They have to show results or they won't get reelected. China, that's not an issue. So you see this in China. They're coming into places like Zambia or Congo or Kenya, and they are spending billions of dollars on things that will not bear any fruit for 10 or 20 years. But when it does bear fruit, it'll be really juicy fruit. And so in Congo, they've given the Congolese a ton of money for highways and for dams because they want to tie up the Congolese supply of minerals. China's economy is dependent on manufacturing, right? All the stuff we all have in this room, it's made in China. Their whole experiment will collapse if their manufacturing industries, don't produce and keep producing and keep growing. And so they're really concerned about making sure they have the raw materials locked up to keep the copper, to use for wires and to keep coltan and cobalt, these very rare elements that are only found in a few places that are used in our cell phones. So that's what I see. I see them going in hard with these big infrastructure projects to tie up mineral supplies. They don't push human rights. They don't push democracy. They couldn't. It would be hypocritical. And these African governments, they like that. And so the leverage of the West is diluted now, because if the West starts bugging Kenya Kenya's going to say, you know what, we'll find another development partner. We don't want your aid. Don't condition your aid. We will find another power to give us aid. Now that China's economy is cooling down a little bit, that's more complicated. But and a few years ago, it was booming so fast. They had like endless amounts to spend. I see this come up with wildlife. It's a topic that I didn't cover that much when I first got the job, and I found myself getting more interested in it. But there's a correlation of where these roads are built through Kenya and Congo and where elephants are getting slaughtered. Because the big demand for ivory is coming from China. It's like 80 or 90% of the world's market. And people in China want ivory for kind of stupid things like toothpicks and little statues and eyeglass frames, basically trinkets. And they are supporting an industry, underground industry, of poachers and traders and corrupt officials that are going into the deepest recesses of Africa and slaughtering elephants like they've never been slaughtered before. There was like 100,000 elephants killed in the last few years, and there's only like 300,000 elephants left, or 400,000. They're kind of hard to count because they hide under trees. But there's a greater percentage of elephants that have been slaughtered in recent years than ever before. That's connected to China. But this, to be fair, these countries need that infrastructure. Nobody else is building big highways and bridges and ports and airports. Like the airport in Nairobi now is unrecognizable from what it was when I was there. That was all built by Chinese labor and financed by Chinese money. Nigeria and South Africa, I don't cover those. I cover East and Central Africa. I think South Africa is going to get worse before it gets better. If you go to South Africa, I traveled there. I actually did, I don't know if anybody in this room has read it, I did a travel story in the New York Times about driving from Nairobi to Cape Town, which my wife was like against the idea every mile. She was probably right. But South Africa's, people are pessimistic there, both white and black. It's interesting. It cuts across all socioeconomic strata. You ask, a wealthy white person, you feel hopeful about the future? Nope. You ask like a lower income black person, you feel hopeful about the future? Nope. Their government is really corrupt. There's a lot of social tension, racial tension. So I think that country's going to have to go through another transition. Nigeria is a powerhouse. It is, as you said, this man here said, Ethiopia is the second biggest country in sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria is the biggest. It's got a huge economy, a huge middle class, a big, bad oil industry. But it's got like one of the worst rebellions and insurrections on the continent with Boko Haram, kidnapping girls, killing people, casting a whole part of that country into chaos. So I think both South Africa and Nigeria are shaky, but eventually I wouldn't be surprised that they climb out of this and reemerge as strong economies.
Then you're in at the front, thanks.
That was an excellent interview with Fareed Zakaria on Sunday, and he complimented you by saying that you had done more to bring attention on the front pages of the New York Times to the African situation than anybody else.
I paid him to say that.
You're right. Where, with so many different countries and so many different conflicts, and where did you get these assignments? Did they originate in your own mind? Was there anything from New York directing you? How did this happen? Where did you find your assignments to cover these multifarious stories?
No, it's a good question, and people ask me that. Most of it I would come up with, because the job is kind of, I'm a writer, reporter, but I'm also sort of an editor in the sense that I'm reading the landscape, trying to figure out what's important. That's actually the hardest part of the job. I cover 13 countries, 400 million people, a space that's about the size of the continental United States. There's a lot going on every day. And I'm conflicted. Sometimes I feel like a failure because I see these really interesting stories coming and I just can't get to them because I'm engaged on something else. And if I try to do too much, they won't be, their quality won't be there. I've tried to pick stories where I feel that there's some injustice or crime or or problem that if I write about it, there could be a solution, there could be more attention, there could be positive change. I feel a responsibility to do that. I carry this big megaphone, you know, with the New York Times written on it. And so I take that seriously, because if I do a good piece on an issue, there's a chance that it's going to reach the right people to make some changes. Not always, but like that story I did in the Ogaden Desert about, you know, when I was thrown in prison with my wife, that story changed the conversation on Ethiopia. Nobody knew about what was happening in that part of Ethiopia. There was talk about sanctions on Ethiopia. There was more pressure on Ethiopia. The UN went into that area for the first time after we did that story. It was entered in the congressional record. You know, people were paying attention. So that made me feel really good. But the problem is, if I do just the conflict, heavy-hitting, hard news stories, I create this perception of Africa on fire, as if the whole continent is cast in conflict. So it's a hard balance. I try to go for, like I do these travel stories. I try to write stories about, you know, sports or music or, you know, economic growth. But I keep finding myself, by my own direction, getting pushed and sucked into conflict stories. Because my job is kind of an old-fashioned job. There's not that many news organizations that have a guy based in Nairobi who goes out into the field with 10,000 bucks in his pocket, hires a dugout canoe, buys fuel, spends a couple nights in the jungle to do one story. Like, there's not many people doing that. So, and in a lot of these countries, the local journalists can't do it. They'll get arrested or killed if they try to take on a story that's going to, you know, affect, you know, that touches the wrong people, powerful people. So that's probably the single hardest part of my job, is choosing what to cover.
Ivo?
You talked about the two paths. Got this? No. Yeah, there we go. The two paths, development and conflict, that you see. So the fuel for both is youth, particularly young men, but youth in general. And the youth bulge that is emerging, that's there, and for the next 30 years is going to fuel this. What trends do you see that can get them in the right direction to fuel development rather than fuel the conflict? What do you see that makes you optimistic as opposed to pessimistic? You talked about South Sudan and the pessimistic, but how do you see this moving in the right direction, if at all?
So no, I think it can move. I think it will move in the right direction in certain places. I have a big story that's slated to run in the next few days in the New York Times about land issues, because Africa's got serious land issues on the horizon. Population, this youth bulge is very real. Many African cultures, people had large families because half the children would die from malaria or cholera. And it wasn't uncommon to have 7 or 8 kids, and if you wanted to have 4 or 5 kids to help take care of you in your old age or manage your farm, you'd have 7 or 8 kids, because some of them were going to die when they were young. That's not happening anymore. The advances in healthcare and malaria treatment, cholera treatment, these like pretty easy to treat diseases, has resulted in low infant mortality, but people are still having big families. So the population of Africa is projected to grow exponentially to 4 billion people by the end of this century. Right now it's about 1 billion. In 1970 it was like 400 million. You look at the rest of the world, China is actually leveling off because of the one-child policy and will soon be decreasing. Europe is decreasing. India is still going up but slowing down. Africa, if you look, it's really interesting. You look at these population projections, the African growth chart is like, you know, a steep curve. And so there's pressure on land because Africans are very connected to their land in emotional ways and cultural ways, but just practically, 70–80% of Africans farm. That's how they survive. And that land is actually getting worse because of climate change, because of over-farming. So this is like a roundabout answer, but there needs to be industry. You need to get people off the land. And in places where you're seeing jobs created in new fields, taking people out of agriculture and putting them in services, in tourism, in financial services, like in Nairobi, you know, internet companies. That's the only way out. Because there's just, like right now, farms, so, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, family had a farm, maybe 10 acres big. Then they had, you know, 5 or 6 kids. that gets divided into 2 acres. Then those 5 or 6 kids have 5 or 6 kids. Then, so this is happening today. These pieces of land are getting very small, and you can't make a living off it. And it's really interesting. It's driving people into the urban areas because of 5 sons, only the oldest one is going to get the farm, and the 4 others go trudging into Kibera or some slum outside of Nairobi hoping for work. So these governments, they need a plan, they need some vision, they need some investment in universities and technology and high-speed internet access. Transportation, just move people around the urban areas better and you're going to save a lot on productivity. You just don't see a lot of that planning. It's all coming from the private sector. All these innovations in Kenya were purely private sector. It's almost like they succeeded despite, government interference. So I think that's going to be the hope, is that these places like Nairobi that are nodes of technology and development start creating jobs really fast.
In the white jacket there, Jenna. Thanks.
I have 2 questions. One is about the issues of the slums in sub-Saharan Africa. In Nairobi, 60% of the population lives in the slums, right? 4.4 million people, 60% of the people live in the slums, right? So what is your perception of that? It's like Treshville and Abidjan. Are those issues related to the slums intractable? The UN Habitat has tried to implement housing in Kibera, but they've been unsuccessful because NGOs have brought suit against them. So my question is, what is your perception of that? And then secondly, my question is more of a global issue. We can talk about the relationships between the North and the South, right? Talk about privatization issues, land reform, structural economic injustices, so to speak. And from your perspective, both professionally and personally, does the West have a moral obligation to the South? Does the North have a moral obligation to the South in terms of redressing those structural injustices?
Thank you.
Definitely. Let me start with the second part. I do feel we have a moral obligation justified on many grounds. Partly that we've created these problems that put these countries in this position. The legacy of colonialism left these African countries, very divided and fragile and delicate. All of a sudden you're a Maasai and you're living on the plains by Mount Kilimanjaro, and one day you find out that the guy down the road is Tanzanian and you're Kenyan, and you're expected all of a sudden to identify strongly as a Kenyan and he's a Tanzanian. That's like, you can't expect that in a few generations. This country had a bloody civil war that tore this country apart, 60, 70 years in. So yeah, I think that we created a lot of these problems, so we do have an obligation. I also think just as, a humanitarian rationale that we should help people if we can do that, and we should share some of the excesses in our world. Climate change is really interesting. It's really sad. Africa is going to suffer the most from climate change. There are millions of people right now that are living just on the edge of an inhospitable environment, of arid, semi-arid areas. There's like a band south of the Sahara Desert with millions of people living in it. That's inhabitable now. And in a couple decades, with a few degrees warmth, it's not going to be inhabitable. Africa produces almost no pollution. Like if you look at these charts at night of the world, like the continent of Africa is dark. There's a few bright little spots, Nairobi, Johannesburg, but the rest is dark. Africa contributes almost no CO2 to global CO2, and it's global CO2 that's going to ruin that land. So like, there's no clearer case of sort of climate change injustice than that. As far as slums, they're kind of crappy, hopeless places to live. Kibera is like everybody's favorite, everybody's favorite slum. It's like an NGO, hotbed these days. It was in this movie that Constant Gardner filmed years ago, where they shot this, these shots of this train running through this slum. And after that, that was like the genesis of all the interest in Kibera, which is good, better that than nothing. But it gets a lot of resources that other slums could use that just aren't as photogenic. They have this thing called flying toilets in these places, where there aren't enough latrines. You actually have to pay to use a latrine, because people live, I don't know what you picture when you hear like an African slum, but they tend to be these large, like sheet metal houses, maybe as big as this room, chopped up into tiny little quarters that you pay, 10 or 20 bucks a month to rent a pretty small space for your family. And they're like these kind of sheds, and they're packed really close together with these muddy paths between them. No lights, no sidewalks, no police go into these areas. They're kind of ungoverned zones in the capital. And there's not many latrines. So they have this thing called a flying toilet, where you go to the bathroom in a plastic bag, you tie a knot around it, and you throw it as far as you can. And you see, like, flying over these slums, you see these plastic bags sitting on the roofs of all these, like, iron, sheds. So yeah, they're miserable places. They're incubators for disease and discontent. And the youth bulge is interesting, because there's some studies that show a correlation between a large youth bulge and political instability, like over time in different parts of the world. So you have to manage that. You're going to have all these young guys coming up. They're not going to be able to get jobs on the land, because the land's going to be spoken for. They're going to be flocking into these slums. I'm not surprised the NGOs are fighting habitat. It's like everybody's got the best intentions. They need vision. It goes back to governance. Like, that's what I tell people. It's like leadership is the biggest problem in Africa. It's not poverty per se. It's not education per se. Many people in Kenya are very well educated. Just about every Kenyan speaks 3 languages fluently. They'll speak English, Swahili, and their native language fluently. 3 very different languages fluently. Just about everybody you'll meet, unless you go deep into the rural areas, and you'll meet people who only speak their local language. The education system in Kenya is pretty good. It's sending kids through high school. They're getting decent, rounded educations. There aren't the jobs for them. There's no planning. There's no vision. Education is kind of held up by NGOs in the West, but then what to do next? So like the slums, they should be dismantled. They should be deconcentrated. There should be housing built and zoning done in these cities, but that doesn't happen. They just kind of spread. And now there's all these contests over land, because land is becoming very valuable because of all this growth and all this investment. And there was just a case, there was a school not far from Kibera that had a playground, a government school, had a playground right next to the school, where the kids would have recess, swing on swings and run around. And one day these police officers showed up and seized the land and said, "We're building a hotel here." And it was government land. And everybody's like, well, who's building a hotel? And then it emerged that it was the vice president of Kenya that had sent the police as like his own private militia to seize this land and take it for a commercial development. And these kids, there was like a few, what's great about Kenya is there's a real push and pull. So when something like this happens, they don't just lie down and take it. So these activists organized all these kids to protest, and the police, being the goons that they were, shot tear gas at them. And there was these videos of these little girls passing out from tear gas, like in the arms of fellow students. It like gives me a chill talking about it. And the instant like that went viral, the project stopped. And that playground's still there today.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but Jeff will be signing copies of his book just now after the program, but please join me in thanking Jeffrey Gettleman. Thanks.
Thank you very much.